economic event and what's actually a more defense-directed or offense-directed security incursion is a legitimate one. We know who the actors are. You have nation states, you have terrorists, you have hackers employed by nation states and terrorists, you have organized crime. There are multiple challenges in dealing with this. Even if we can actually attribute who the attacker was and made a determination of the consequences, what do we do about it? What do we do about it? And I mean, and again speaks, I think, to the kind of collaboration that focuses on information sharing and a true public-private partnership with the private sector rather than compliance. Because with due respect to my profession as an attorney, I don't see compliance lawyers as being the best means of assuring that we've enhanced our security in this country. Because a regulation means there'll be a block, there'll be a check box, and you'll check and you said, okay, you did what the federal government wanted to do. And frankly, the technology available today, offensive and defensive, as we speak, is changing, and it'll be different tomorrow and the years ahead. So I think the best insurance right now is to take frankly, the embrace of, I think it's Pat Gallagher running NIST, who I think testified perhaps in this committee previously about, look, let's continue down this path of setting voluntary standards that both the federal government and the private sector agree upon, and let's see how well they do about taking those standards and devising the kind of defensive infrastructure that they need before we start thinking about regulations. Because I'm afraid we'll never be, I'm going to say this, Congress 4 or 5 years ago appropriately gave to DHS chemical facility anti-terrorism standards and regs. I think we're 3 or 4 years later. There's a lot of people working really hard on it, but that delegation of authority doesn't mean it was executed in the appropriate way. And I'm simply saying, for the time being, I think we ought to let this, I think the President Obama set it up with his executive order. I think we ought to let that come to fruition before we even think about before we think about regulations. I might add the 3 or 4 critical sectors, and I think you were alluding them to in your comment. You got financial services, you got energy, you got transportation. I must say, from my experience, these sectors have spent and will continue to spend hundreds of billions of dollars, sometime on their own, sometimes in cooperation and collaboration with Homeland Security. But we've evolved a long way. I remember we created the Computer Emergency Response Team at Carnegie Mellon because this was an emerging problem back in 2001 and 2002. Now it's a fact of life. We're going to be dealing with this forevermore. Forevermore. And so I don't think we're ever going to have a regulatory compliance scheme that's going to be able to keep up with a dynamic environment. So my recommendation, based on the purpose of this hearing, even though I think your question is a very important one, I think we need to let the NIST standards play out and really push to far more collaboration between the public and private sector. One anecdote, my company deals with some significant private sector companies that deal with cyber issue, and one of them, which is a multinational corporation, walked into one of the Alphabet agencies and said, you know, we've been hacked into, and the Alphabet agency said, we know. And they said, well, we're a taxpaying group of folks. Did you ever think it might be helpful that if we sat down and worked together on it? So I think, again, focusing on collaboration and sharing rather than compliance is the best approach for the time being.
You want some more time? All right, good. We made good use of that. As we start a second round, I want to preface. Let me just say, you mentioned Pat Gallagher, who did testify here before our committee earlier this. I think it was earlier this year, and from NIST. And he said every now and then witnesses show this great wisdom. And in his testimony before us, I think he said, and I'll paraphrase, he said, we'll know we're on the right track when good cybersecurity policy and good business policy are one. That's what he said. That's pretty good advice. We've gotten a lot of good advice here today as well. I also preface my next question by saying that here we are. It's the anniversary of 9/11. Here we are, maybe days before the U.S. could launch limited cruise missile attacks at some targets in Syria. Here we are, knowing that we're under attack, cyber front 24/7. And we have an acting Secretary of Homeland Security, and we have an acting Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security. And that just cries out for the administration and for us to do our jobs, to make sure we have in place the kind of confirmed leadership that we need, capable, confirmed leadership. Okay. That having been said, let me turn to a topic that I've just mentioned that's on our minds, and that is the potential for military action, limited military action in Syria, unless that country relinquishes its chemical warfare supply and dismantles their capability to create more chemical weapons. The prospect of our using military force is a serious matter, weighs on us all. Certainly the President, who came and visited our caucuses yesterday, the Senate, both Democrat and Republican. I want to ask, as we prepare to make whatever decisions we need to make in the days ahead in conjunction with the President, I think it's important for us to get answers to a few more questions. And I'd like to ask this seasoned panel of national security experts for some of your thoughts. If the President does choose to take limited military action against the Assad regime, what impact do you think that might have on our homeland security? What should DHS be doing to prepare for some potential consequences that would flow from U.S. action, even a limited basis, against Syria? Please. And Mr. Baker,
sure, I'll be glad to.
If you'd like to lead off, that'd be great.
We absolutely need to prepare here by taking on Syria. We are also taking on Hezbollah and Iran, the backers of that regime. And if they choose to try to make the United States regret the sanctions it imposes, they have very substantial capabilities. Hezbollah has its own cruise missiles, and so a terrorist organization with that kind of capability certainly can develop and use cyber attacks, or can send people to the United States to carry out attacks. So we would have to go on a pretty substantial alert basis. They'd be biting off a lot. They're already on alert against Israel and fighting in Syria themselves, so they may decide that it's not prudent to attack, but hope's not a strategy for us. We need to be worried about defensive capabilities, and for the first time, we face the risk that we will have a cyber attack aimed at getting us to quit engaging in military action. Iran is widely blamed for a series of attacks on our financial institutions that have been visibly punch-pulling exercises in which the attackers announce how long the attack will last and what day it will happen, and obviously they could do more and cause more damage. And again, Iran, having blamed us for Stuxnet, is going to be less constrained about using that kind of weapon against the United States on behalf of an ally like Syria. So we will have to up our game both physically and virtually.
Okay, thank you. Admiral Allen.
Let me start with a caveat. It's been several years since I sat in the tank. I'm not up to speed on operational briefing, so I'm just going to talk in generalities. I wouldn't want to speak for anybody or make any comments that would not be appropriate in this situation. In regard to cyber threats related to any untoward act, and it could be generated by this. One of the problems we're dealing with right now is we're trying to evolve these structures. And we've talked about them extensively here today. It's tough to talk about how you would deal with one of these things when the answer is what you talk about you need to do and you haven't done yet. But let me focus on something called advanced persistent threat, which is something that's discussed both domestically and internationally. And it relates a little bit to what Stuart was talking about. There are footprints that are left regarding behaviors that go on out there that are indications that something is going to occur. And one of the reasons the changes that need to be made in the cybersecurity posture of this country have been made and continue to be looked at in the executive order and the NIST standards and everything else is that we need to move to continuous monitoring, and after that we need to move to continually be able to look at the precursor or the context that's being set for an attack, and we do know what those are. And a lot of it has to do with basically analyzing social media because people talk about this. So in regards to any threat situation, and this one specifically, I think there ought to be a fine-tuning of our sensors out there related to what's being talked about in social media and what types of activities are taking place. You know, back after 9/11, we used to talk about chatter. Well, we have a much better capability now with we have a mismatch in computation, spectrum, and bandwidth management in this country. We don't utilize enough against these problems. I think in this case, we'll be looking at advanced persistent threat because if they're going to do anything immediately, they've already had to put the mechanism in place to do it.
Thank you. Governor Ridge.
I appreciate the question, and I must tell you, based on a personal relationship, because you and I have had many long conversations over the years about topics of national interest, I'm going to resist the opportunity to tell you how I think we got into this mess and how I think we ought to get out of it and answer your question exactly. It reminds me of the National Security Council coming over to what was then a small core staff between the time I was sworn in as secretary and the intervening 6 weeks before we opened the door on March 1st, 2003 for the first day of the Department of Homeland Security. A couple members of the national security staff come over and said, very confidential at the time, we're probably going into Iraq. We know you don't have a department, but maybe you should think about a potential blowback in this country and what can we do about to minimize the effects. So one, I think your question is very appropriate, and play the what if, and then figure out how we respond to the if occurs. I think we've learned a lot since Liberty Shield. I think, frankly, the state and locals are far better prepared. We know DEFCON. I mean, even the much maligned and occasionally referred to color-coded threat warning system, which I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. At least we know now there are certain levels of security that are embedded in the federal government and even within some of the state and locals and the private sector, number one. Number two, I think the most likely pushback would be in the cyber realm. And to that end, again, it's a great place for me to suggest that this is precisely where the federal government should be sharing the precursors that it may know or the addresses that it has seen as it relates to the digital incursions that we've been hit with from the Syrian army, perhaps the Hezbollah and the like. This is a classic example where we probably in this instance are more familiar with the electronic incursions directed at us from Russia, from Syria, et cetera, and precisely the time that that information should be shared with not just state and locals, but with the private sector. So long term, I think we are far better prepared to respond to an attack, because I do think the word's been used, we are far more resilient today than we were 12 years ago. But this is an excellent opportunity for the federal government to share some of the information that I'm sure they have that the private sector would like to check that information against what they see occurring on the grid with the SCADA systems, the financial institutions and transportation, et cetera, to see perhaps they're missing something and can be better prepared if there's an electronic attack, a digital attack after if we go into Syria.
All right. Thank you all for those very, very thoughtful responses. Governor Ridge mentioned how he'll take with him to his grave the work that the leadership that he provided with respect to the color coding alert. I'm not sure if there's some way to work that into your tombstone and the narrative of your life. I was kidding my wife recently who said, "Why do you spend so much time on postal reform?" And Dr. Kohler and I spent, along with our staff, just an inordinate amount of time this year trying to agree and agreeing on bipartisan legislation. But she was kidding me about there should be something about postal and post reform on my tombstone. And I thought out loud, I said, well, maybe what would be appropriate would be just these words, return to sender. So.
It'd be nice. Again, it's a classic example of something that the Congress are going to have to deal with, I believe. Look, we know that Russia and China have cyber attacks as part of their public warfighting strategy. We know this is a condition of not only military and diplomatic but business activity, international activity for the rest of the world. But again, it's a place where you need the private sector and the public sector to sit down and really cooperate and determine if there is an attack, what are the consequences and who's responsible for returning it to sender. I mean, all this has to be worked out, and again, I think that just calls for collaboration, cooperation, communication, and it doesn't require for a regulatory scheme where you check the compliance box and everybody feels that they're safe after that.
Good. All right. Thanks so much, Dr. Coburn.
I think Governor Ridge agrees with this. I'd love to have the other panelists' thoughts. We spend billions on grants every year. Is it your opinion that those grants ought to be risk-based rather than parochial-based?
Absolutely.
A legislative fellow in my office be granted.
Senator, we're in a quorum call.
Oh, I would ask that the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. I would ask unanimous consent that Sergio Aguirre, a legislative fellow in my office, be granted floor privileges during morning business today, September 11, 2013.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise to speak to the grave issue of the Syria resolution currently pending before the body. It is September 11th. I know many members have expressed thoughts, and we're all thinking about that day and what it means to our country. In a few minutes, I'll leave and go to the Pentagon to be with Pentagon staffers and family members as they commemorate the anniversary of this horrible tragedy in American life. And the shadow of that tragedy and its rippling effects even today, 12 years later, definitely are a matter on my mind and heart as I think about this issue with respect to Syria. Also on my mind and heart as I think about this grave issue is its connection to Virginia. Virginia, I believe, is the most militarily connected state in our country. Our map is a map of American military history, the battle at Yorktown, the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, the attack on the Pentagon on 9/11. Our map is a map of American military history. We are more connected to the military in the sense 1 in 9 of our citizens is a veteran. We have active duty at the Pentagon, training to be officers at Quantico, the largest concentration of naval power in the world at Hampton Roads. We have DOD contractors. We have DOD civilians like Army nurses. We have ROTC cadets, Guard and Reserve member, and military families, all of whom care very, very deeply about the issue that we're grappling with as a nation. And, Madam President, I'm sure in your state, as in mine, and across the country, there is a tremendous war weariness on this 12th anniversary of 9/11, and that affects the way we look at this question of whether the United States should potentially engage in military action. I cast a vote last week, and I'm going to talk about it in the Senate Foreign Relations Commission, to authorize limited military action, and I've spent the days since that vote talking to Virginians and hearing from them, and hearing from some who aren't happy with the vote I cast. I spent a day talking to ROTC cadets at Virginia State University, folks who are training to be officers who might fight in future conflicts for this country. And then I spent Friday in Hampton Roads with veterans and military families talking about the choices before us. I heard a youngster last night, a teenager, say something that really struck me. She stood up. This was a teenager who doesn't have any direct connection to the military herself, no family members in service, but at an event I was at, she stood up and said, "I don't know war, but all my generation and I know is war." Think about that. I don't know war, but all my generation and I know is war. During her entire life that she's been, kind of a thinking person, aware of the outside world, we've been at war, and that makes us tremendously war-weary, and I understand that. And so trying to separate out all those feelings and do what's right is hard. Like many Virginians, I've got family in the military who are going to be directly affected by what we do or what we don't do. And I think about those family members and all Virginians and all Americans who have loved ones in service as I contemplate this difficult issue. I want to say three things. First, I want to praise the President for bringing this matter to Congress, which is, I believe, courageous and historic. Secondly, I want to talk about why I believe authorizing limited military action makes sense. And third, I want to talk about the need to exhaust all diplomatic opportunities and openings, including the ones that were reported beginning Monday of this week by Russia and Syria. First, on the President coming to Congress, this is what was intended by the framers of the Constitution, that prior to the initiation of significant military action, and this would be significant by all accounts, that Congress should have to weigh in. The framers wanted that to be so because they had read history. They knew that executives might be a little too prone to initiating military action, and they wanted to make sure that the people's elected representatives had a vote about whether an action should be initiated. Once initiated, there's only one commander-in-chief, but at the initiation, Congress needs to be involved. That was the intent from the very beginning of this nation, from 1787. There was an understanding that in an emergency, a president might need to act immediately, but even in that case, there would need to be a reckoning, coming back to Congress and seeking approval of presidential action. And so the President, by bringing this matter to Congress, has, in my view, acted in accord with law, acted in accord with the intent of the framers of the Constitution, and actually, Madam President, he's done so in a way that has cleared up some sloppiness about the way this institution and the President has actually done this over time. Only 5 times in the history of the nation has Congress declared war. Over 120 times, presidents have initiated military action without congressional approval, at least prior congressional approval. Presidents have overreached their power, and Congress has often made a decision to avoid being accountable for this most grave decision that we make as a nation. And so I praise the President for bringing it to Congress, the people's body, because I think it's in accord with law. But, Madam President, I praise him for a second reason. It's not just about the constitutional allocation of responsibility. Responsibilities were allocated in the Constitution, in my view, for a very important moral reason. And the moral reason is this: we cannot ask our men and women in service to put their lives on the line if there's not a consensus of the legislative and executive branches that the mission is worthwhile. That's why it's important for Congress to weigh in on a decision to initiate military hostility, because absent that, you face the situation, and it would be a very real possibility in this instance, that a president would make a decision that an action was worth, or a war was worth fighting, but a Congress would not support it, and that would put the men and women who have to face the risk and potentially risk their lives in a very, very difficult situation. If we're going to ask people to risk their lives in any kind of a military action, we shouldn't be asking them to do it if the legislative and political branches haven't reached some consensus that it should be done. So that's the first point I want to make. I want to thank the President for cleaning up this sloppiness in the historical allocation of responsibilities between a President and Congress, for taking a historic step, as he said he would as a candidate, of bringing a question like this to Congress. We may be unable to act in certain cases because we're divided, but if we act, and we act united, we are much stronger, both militarily and in the moral example that we pose to the world, and it's the right thing to do for the troops who bear the burden of battle. Second, I want to talk about the actual authorization. We grappled with this. The news came out about the chemical weapons attack on August the 21st, and other colleagues and I, 18 of us, returned last week, members of the Foreign Relations Committee. Madam President, you came and attended some of our classified briefings, and we grappled with the question about whether, in this circumstance, a limited military authorization was appropriate. And I voted yes. And I voted yes for a very simple reason. I believe there has to be a consequence for using chemical weapons against civilians. It's pretty simple. There's a lot of nuances to this and a lot of subtleties and a lot of questions about whether the plans might accomplish the particular objective we hope, and those are all legitimate questions. But at the end of the day, I feel so very strongly that if chemical weapons have been used, and in this case they were, and used in a massive scale, and used against civilians, that there must be a consequence for that. There must be a sharp consequence for it, and if there isn't, the whole world will be worse off. I believe that if the United States acts in this way to uphold an important international norm, perhaps the most important international norm, that weapons of mass destruction can't be used against civilians, if we act to uphold the norm, we will have partners. How many partners? We'll see. Maybe not as many as we would wish, but we will have partners. But I'm also convinced that if the United States does not act to uphold this principle, I don't think anyone will act. If we act, we'll have partners. If we don't, I don't think anyone will act, and that's the burden of leadership that's on this country's shoulders. Briefly, we know about the history of the chemical weapons ban, and we're so used to it that it seems normal, but just to kind of step back from it, if you think about it, it's not that normal at all. The chemical weapons ban came out of World War I. World War I was a mechanized slaughter with over 10 million deaths, a slaughter unlike anything that had ever been seen in global history. And there were all kinds of weapons used in World War I that had never been used before, including dropping bombs out of airplanes. Dropping bombs out of airplanes, new kinds of artillery, new kinds of munitions, new kinds of machine guns, chemical weapons, all kinds of mechanized and industrialized weapons were used in World War I. And the American troops who served in 1917 and 18 were gassed. They'd be sleeping in a trench trying to get a couple hours of sleep, and they'd wake up coughing their lungs out or blinded, or they wouldn't wake up because some of the gases were invisible and silent. With no knowledge, you could suddenly lose your life or be disabled for life because of chemical weapons. Now, the number of casualties in World War I because of chemical weapons was small as a percentage of the total casualties. But, Madam President, it's interesting what happened. After World War I, the nations of the world who had been at each other's throats, who had battled each other, gathered a few years later, and it's interesting to think what they banned and what they didn't ban. They didn't ban aerial bombardment. They didn't ban machine guns. They didn't ban rockets. They didn't ban shells. They didn't ban artillery, but they did decide to ban chemical weapons. They were able to agree, as combatants all agree, that chemical weapons were unacceptable and should neither be manufactured nor used. Now, it can seem maybe a little bit illogical or even absurd. Why is it worse to be killed by a chemical weapon than a machine gun or by an artillery shell? I don't know what the logic is to it, but all I can assume is that that experience of that day and moment had inspired some common spark of humanity in all of these cultures and all of these combating nations, and they all agreed that the use of chemical weapons should be banned heretofore on the earth. And nations agreed with that ban. The Soviet Union was on board. The United States was on board. So many nations were on board. Syria ultimately signed that accord in 1968. And even in the midst of horrific wars where humans have done horrific things to each other, since 1925, the passage of the ban is stuck. The international community has kept that ember of humanity that says these weapons should not be used. The ember has been kept alive. And only two dictators until now have used weapons, Adolf Hitler using these weapons against millions of Jews and others, and Saddam Hussein using the weapons against Kurds, his own people, and then against Iranians in the Iraq-Iran war. When you think about it, I mean, it's pretty amazing. With all the barbarity that's happened since 1925, this has generally stuck with the exception of Adolf Hitler and Saddam Hussein until now. And the beneficiaries of this policy have been civilians, but they've also been American servicemen and women. The servicemen and women who fought in World War I were gassed from this country, but the Americans who fought in World War II in Europe and North Africa and the Pacific, who fought in Korea, who fought in Vietnam, who fought in Afghanistan, who fought in Iraq, who fought in other minor military involvements, have never had to worry about facing chemical weapons. No matter how bad the opponent was, American troops haven't had to worry about it, and the troops of other nations haven't had to worry about it either. This is a very important principle, and it's a positive thing for humanity that we reached this accord and that we've honored it. So what happens now if there isn't a consequence for Bashar al-Assad's escalating use of chemical weapons to include chemical weapons against civilians? What happens if we let go of the norm and we say, look, that may have been okay for the 20th century, but we're tougher and more cynical people now. There aren't any limits now. We don't have to abide by any norms now. Well, I think what happens is, and the lessons of history will demonstrate that this will happen, is that an atrocity unpunished will engender future atrocities. We'll see more atrocities in Syria against civilians and others. We'll see more atrocities abroad. We will see atrocities, and we will have to face the likely consequence that our service members who have not had to face chemical weapons since 1925 will now have to prepare to face them on the battlefield. If you can use chemical weapons and there's no serious consequence, guess what else? You can manufacture chemical weapons. Guess what else? You can sell chemical weapons. You can proliferate chemical weapons. And so it's not just a matter of their use will be encouraged, but their manufacture and sale by individuals or companies or countries wanting to make money will proliferate. This has a devastating potential effect on allies of the United States in the neighborhoods around Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, Turkey. It would have a devastating impact on other allies like South Korea who border nations that use chemical weapons. It could encourage other nations that have non-chemical weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons, to think the world won't stand up, there's no consequence for their use, you can violate treaties, you can violate norms, and no one is willing to stand up and oppose it. And so, Madam President, that was the reason in the Foreign Relations Committee last week that I voted for this limited authorization of military force, fully aware the debate on the floor might amend or change it and open to that possibility. But I thought it was important to stand up as a representative of Virginia and a representative of this country to say that the use of chemical weapons may, in the 21st century, suddenly be okay to Bashar al-Assad, may suddenly be okay to Vladimir Putin and others, but it's not okay to the United States of America, and we're willing to stand up and oppose them. And so the limited military authorization, as you know, that is on this floor, talks about action to punish and action to deter and action to degrade the ability of the Syrian regime to use chemical weapons. The goal is to take the chemical weapons stockpile of this nation out of the battlefield equation. The civil war will continue. We don't have the power as the United States to dictate the outcome of that war. But chemical weapons should not be part of that war, and it should not be part of any war. The authorization was limited, no ground troops. It was limited in scope and duration. But make no mistake, the authorization was a clear statement of American resolve that there has to be a consequence for use of these weapons in violation of international norms that have been in place since 1925. Finally, Madam President, I want to talk about diplomacy and about the urgent need that I know we all feel in this body and as Americans to pursue diplomatic alternatives, including some current alternatives on the table that would be preferable, far preferable, to military action. It is very important that we be creative. It's very important that we have direct talks with the perpetrators and enablers of these crimes, but also intermediaries and independent nations to look for diplomatic alternatives. We've been trying to do so and thus far, until recently, been blocked in the United Nations. But the authorization for military force actually had that as its first caveat. The authorization said, Mr. President, if this passes, we authorize you to use military force, but before you do, you have to come back to Congress and stipulate that all diplomatic angles, options, and possibilities have been exhausted. So on the committee, and with the wording of this authorization, we were very focused on the need to continue diplomatic effort. And that's why it was so gratifying on Monday, on my way back to D.C. after a long week here last week, to hear that Russia had come to the table with a proposal inspired by discussion with administration figures, a proposal that the Syrian chemical weapons stockpile, one of the largest in the world, would be placed under international control. And then a few hours later, and this was no coincidence, Syria, Russia's client state essentially spoke up and said we would very much entertain placing our chemical weapons under international control. And Syria has even suggested beyond that that they would finally sign on to the 1990s era Chemical Weapons Convention. They're one of 6 nations in the world who refused to sign it. Syria wouldn't even acknowledge they had chemical weapons until 2012, even though the world knew it. But over the last 48 hours, we've seen diplomatic options emerge that, Madam President, are very serious and meaningful. In fact, and it's too early to tell, but in fact, if we can have these discussions and find an accord where Syria will sign on to the convention and where Syria will put these weapons under international control, we will not only have avoided a bad thing, avoided military action, which none of us want unless it's necessary, but we will have accomplished a good thing for Syrians, a good thing for humanity, by taking this massive chemical weapons stockpile off the battlefield and submitted it to international control and eventually destruction. So the offer that is on the table and the action that's happened since Monday is very serious and very significant, very encouraging, and, Madam President, it could be a game changer in this discussion. Now, I said it's serious. What we still need to determine is whether it's sincere. It's serious and significant, but obviously what the administration needs to do in tandem with UN is determine whether it's sincere. I will just conclude and finally say this. I think it is very important for Americans, for the citizens, for members of Congress to understand, we should make no mistake about this. The diplomatic offer that is on the table wasn't on the table until America demonstrated that it was prepared to stand up for the proposition that chemical weapons cannot be used. I have no doubt that had we not taken the action in Congress last week in the Foreign Relations Commission to show that America is resolved, if no one else in the world is resolved to do something, at least we would be resolved to do something. Had we not taken that action, Russia would not have suddenly changed their position. They've been blocking action after action in the Security Council and come forward with this serious recommendation. And had we not taken that action, a Syria that was willing to use with impunity these weapons against civilians, had they not been frightened of what America might do, Syria would not have come forward either. And so American resolve is important. American resolve is important to show the world that we value this norm and will enforce it, even to the point of limited military action. But even more important, American resolve is important because it encourages other nations, even the perpetrators of crimes, even the enablers of the use of these weapons, it encourages them to come forward and shoulder the responsibilities that they have, or so we pray in the days ahead. But what I would ask, Madam President, of my colleagues and my countrymen is that because it has been our resolve that has produced a possibility for a huge diplomatic breakthrough and win, I would ask that we continue to be resolved, continue to show strength, continue to hold out the option that there will be a consequence for this international crime, that America will play a leading role in making sure that there is a consequence, and as long as we stand strong with this resolve, we will maximize the chance that we will be able to obtain the diplomatic result that we want. Madam President, thank you very much. I yield the floor. And, Madam President, I have 2 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders. I ask unanimous consent that these requests be agreed to and that these requests be printed in the record.
Without objection.
Madam President.
Majority Webb, minority Webb.
Madam President, my dad was a pilot in the Army Air Corps in World War II, served in the 8th Air Force, the 303rd Bomb Group, stationed in Molesworth, England. And on his 26th bombing mission over Nazi Germany, he was shot down and captured as a prisoner of war, where he served for the remainder of the war. So I learned at a very young age that when we start talking about matters of war and peace, that we must take these very, very seriously. So I appreciate the fact that President Obama came to Capitol Hill yesterday and spoke to both the Democratic Conference and the Republican Conference. And I further appreciate very much the fact that President Obama spoke to the American people last night. I actually wish he had done it a little earlier, since the chemical weapons attacks occurred on the 21st of August. It was roughly 3 weeks after that that he finally spoke to the American people, and I think it would have been better for him and better for the country if he had done it sooner and demonstrated a greater urgency. But I'm glad he did it. When a president asks the American people to support our United States military in the use of military force, he has a solemn obligation to communicate to the American people how it will protect America's vital interests. He has an obligation to tell the American people why going to war is absolutely essential to U.S. national security. He has an obligation to lay out clear and realistic objectives. And finally, he has an obligation to explain how military intervention fits within America's broader foreign policy strategy. Now, I've used the word war advisedly because sometimes I think we get caught up in political correctness around here, talking about workplace violence at Fort Hood, overseas contingency operations. As a veteran of the United States Marine Corps who served 40 years told me just this last week when I asked for his advice on what the President was asking us to do, he said, any time you kill people in the name of the United States government, it's an act of war. So like others in this chamber over the last few weeks, I've attended meetings with the President where I've had the honor of being in his presence and listening to him in person on 2 occasions, listening to other administration officials, and I've sat through hours, like all of us, through hours of classified briefings with the Central Intelligence Agency, the Department of Defense, and the State Department. I've listened intently as Senator Kerry described in what I thought at first was an inadvertent statement made as a result of fatigue, and I can only imagine what he must have been going through, shuttling back and forth around the world to try to resolve this issue. But he described this strike as unbelievably small. I was further surprised when I heard the White House press secretary said, no, it wasn't a gaffe. He didn't misspeak. I mean, we all misspeak from time to time, so I expected him to say, well, you know, he should have used other words or might have used other words. And then Senator Kerry himself, now Secretary Kerry, said, no, I didn't misspeak. I was encouraged to hear the President address the nation because I believe before you take your case overseas to American allies, that you should first make the case here at home to the American people. In making their case for a brief, limited attack against Syria, administration officials have repeatedly said that U.S. military intervention would not seek to topple the Assad regime, even though regime change has been the policy of the U.S. government since at least August 2011. They've said that their military campaign would not seek to change the momentum in a Syria's civil war, even though, as I mentioned a moment ago, our government's official policy is one of regime change, that Assad must go. My view is that a U.S. attack that allowed Assad to remain in power with one of the world's largest stockpiles of chemical weapons would not promote U.S. national security interests. Indeed, it's not hard to imagine how that kind of intervention could actually backfire and end up being a propaganda disaster. Many of us are concerned about upholding America's credibility, particularly when it comes to matters like this, and I share their concern. But it would really help if before we launch a half-hearted, ineffectual attack that gives our enemies a major propaganda victory, that we come up with a more coherent plan and strategy for accomplishing our public policy goals. You know, Murphy's Law, what can go wrong will go wrong. Well, there's a Murphy's Law of war, too, perhaps many of them. But one of them is that no plan to go to war survives the first contact intact. In other words, you can plan to shoot the first bullet, but you can't control what happens after that. In all likelihood, such an attack would hurt our credibility and reduce U.S. public support for future interventions. And this is what I mean. If we were to take a military attack against Assad in order to punish him for using chemical weapons, which is a horrific act on his part, a barbaric act on his part, but it left Assad in power, what's he going to tell the rest of the world? He's going to say, the world's greatest military force took a shot at me, and I'm still here. I'm still in power. I won, and America lost. That's how I can see this backfiring in a very serious way, undermining America's credibility. Credibility that we must keep intact, particularly as we look at larger, looming threats like the Iranian aspiration for nuclear weapons. I want to be clear, though, Madam President, I would be willing to support a military operation in Syria, but only if our intervention met certain criteria. Number one, if it directly addressed the nightmare scenario of Assad's use of chemical weapons falling into the hands of terrorists. It's not just his use of chemical weapons on his own people, it's the potential that those chemical weapons could get in the hands of al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations and harm either Americans or American interests around the world. The second criterion, I could support a resolution if it involved the use of decisive and overwhelming force without self-imposed limitations and without leaking to our enemies what our tactics are and what it is we would not do, and ruining one of his greatest tools in war, which is the element of surprise. I mean, why in the world would we tell Assad what we are going to do? And Senator Kerry said it would be a small attack. And why would we tell Assad what we won't do? Eliminating both the ambiguity of our position and the potential threat of even more serious and overwhelming military force. Number three, I would be willing to support an authorization if it was an integral part of a larger, coherent Syria policy that clearly defined the political end state. I still remember General Petraeus, the head of Central Command, covering Iraq and Afghanistan, talking about our policy in those countries. He said the most important question, perhaps, when you go to war is, how does this end? We need a clearly defined political end state that we're trying to achieve by what the President requested, and we need an outline of a realistic path to get there. And fourth, I believe that it's important that we have a sizable international coalition of nations, each of which is contributing to the war effort. Now, this is an amazing reversal for the President since the time he was a senator and a presidential candidate. To say we're not going to the United Nations, and I understand why, because of China and Russia, their veto of any resolution out of the Security Council. We're not going to go to NATO. Indeed, the President seemed content, or at least resigned, to going it alone. And if it's true that this red line is the international community's red line, then the international community needs to contribute to the effort to hold Assad accountable. The problem is, Madam President, that President Obama's requested authorization for the use of military force under these circumstances fails to meet each of those criteria. He's failed to make the case that a short, limited military campaign would promote our vital interests and our national security. He's failed to lay out a clear and realistic objectives that could be attained through the use of that military force. And he's failed to offer a compelling description of how his proposed intervention would advance America's broader foreign policy strategy. Indeed, how it would advance his own policy of regime change. Therefore, if we were asked to vote on an authorization under these circumstances, I would vote no. I am under no illusion, none of us are, about the utter depravity of Bashar al-Assad. Over the last 2.5 years, his regime has committed unspeakable acts of rape, torture, and murder. The chemical weapons attacks, by the way, by Senator Kerry's, Secretary Kerry's own testimony in the House of Representatives, there were 11 earlier uses of chemical weapons, but they were smaller. But can you imagine the difficulty of trying to impose a red line when that red line's crossed 11 times before the President finally decides to try to enforce it? But there's no question that use of chemical weapons show an appalling disregard for human life and a cruel desire to terrorize the Syrian population. I, like others, have consistently demanded that Russia stop arming Assad and stop defending him and blocking UN Security Council resolutions and aiding and abetting his barbaric atrocities against his own people. I want to see a free, democratic Syria as much as anyone else. But that does not mean that I will vote to support a reckless, ill-advised military intervention that could jeopardize our most important national security interests. There have been a lot of people who've opined on the President's request, some better informed than others. One I thought that was particularly convincing was retired Army Major General Robert Scales, who's written that the path to war chosen by the Obama administration, quote, violates every principle of war, including the element of surprise, achieving mass, and having a clearly defined and obtainable objective. As I said, we know that the latest chemical weapons attack occurred on August the 21st, but President Obama didn't address the nation for 3 weeks until 3 weeks later. The Syrians have now, of course, had weeks to prepare for any impending military intervention, and no doubt have moved the chemical weapons into civilian population centers to protect them from any attack. And they've undoubtedly moved their other military equipment to other locations. With no element of surprise, it makes the potential for success of any military intervention much less, and reveals that there is no real coherent policy in this regard. Consider what happened last Monday Secretary of State Kerry made what he calls an off-the-cuff remark about the possibility of canceling a missile strike if Assad turned over all of his chemical weapons. In the same statement, he said he wasn't really sure that would work or that he would ever really be serious about it, but he did say it. Russia, of course, immediately responded by offering to broker a transfer of Syria's WMD to international monitors. Now, after spending weeks trying to make the case for war, President Obama has asked that the vote in this chamber be canceled and is apparently treating the Russian-Syrian proposal as a serious diplomatic breakthrough. I would caution all of us, the American people and all of our colleagues, to be skeptical, for good reason, at this lifeline that Vladimir Putin has now thrown the administration. I would remind the President and our colleagues that Russia itself is not in full compliance with the Chemical Weapons Convention, nor is it even in compliance with nuclear arms control obligations that are subject to an international treaty. Now, the litany of Russian offenses is long, but I would remind President Obama that since he launched the so-called Russian reset, Moscow has vetoed UN resolutions on Syria, sent advanced weaponry to the Assad regime, stolen elections, stoked anti-Americanism, made threats over our possible deployment of missile defense systems. It has expelled USAID from Russia, pulled out of the Nunn-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program. It's banned U.S. citizens from adopting Russian children and offered asylum to NSA leaker Edward Snowden. In short, we have very little reason to believe that Moscow is a reliable diplomatic partner. The Russians are not part of the problem in Syria. They are part of the problem in Syria, not part of the solution. Let me say that clearly. The Russians are part of the problem in Syria. They are not, credibly, part of the solution. Moreover, I'm curious to learn how international monitors would adequately confirm the disposal of chemical weapons by a terror-sponsoring dictatorship amid a ferocious civil war. You know, while this strike that the President talked about might have been limited in his imagination, if you're Bashar al-Assad, this is total war, because he realizes the only way he will leave power is in a pine box. He knows that. This is total war. I asked the President yesterday, I said, well, what happens if, in order to punish Assad, we intervene militarily and it doesn't work? In his fight for his survival and survival of the regime, he uses them again in an act of desperation. The President said, we'll hit him again. Well, clearly what had become a limited strike could quickly spiral out of control into a full-blown engagement in Syria. I think the President's own words suggest that. But of course, the Assad regime is one that refuses to acknowledge the full extent of its chemical arsenal. And this is something we'll be hearing more about. It has bioweapons capability. Bioweapons capability, actually a much greater threat to American interests than chemical weapons, which are much more difficult to transport and much harder to handle. And this is the same dictatorship that was secretly working on a nuclear weapons program before the Israelis took care of it in 2007. Madam President, we've been told that however unfortunate President Obama's red line comment might have been, upholding his threat is about maintaining American credibility. And I admit, American credibility in matters of war and peace and national security are very, very important. But America's credibility on the world stage is about more than just presidential rhetoric. It's about defining clear objectives and establishing a coherent strategy for achieving them. In the case of Syria, President Obama has not offered a clear strategy or clearly laid out his objectives. Given all that, I'm not surprised that the American people don't support the President's call for the use of limited military force in Syria. Those are the calls I got in my office as I went back to Texas. I kept hearing people who I would think under almost any other circumstances would say, you know, if America's national security interests are at stake, then we're behind the President. We're behind military intervention. But they simply saw an incoherent policy and objectives that were not clearly laid out to obtain the result that the President himself said is our policy. Well, the most recent experience we've had as a country with limited war has been Libya. And I've heard the President tout that as perhaps an example about how we can get in and get out. The 2011 military operation that deposed Muammar Gaddafi was supposed to be a showcase example of a limited operation in which America led from behind and still obtained its objectives without putting U.S. boots on the ground. Unfortunately, the administration had no real plan for what happened after Gaddafi fell. We all know that it was 1 year ago today in Benghazi when terrorists linked to al-Qaeda massacred 4 brave Americans, including U.S. Ambassador Chris Stevens. Today, Libya is spiraling into chaos and rapidly becoming a failed state. Earlier this month, a leading British newspaper reported that Libya has almost entirely stopped producing oil as the government loses control over much of the country to militia fighters. All sorts of bad actors, including terrorist groups, are flooding into the security vacuum, and Libyans are increasingly at the mercy of militias which act outside the law. Madam President, before I conclude, I just want to say a few words about America's armed forces and America's role in the world. We all know and are extraordinarily proud of our men and women who wear the uniform of the United States military. No military in history has been more powerful. No military has ever been more courageous. No military has been more selfless and fought and bled and died to protect innocent people in far-flung places across the planet. No military has ever done more to promote peace and prosperity around the world. I have every confidence that if called upon to act, our men and women in uniform will do just that. They will perform their duties with the utmost skill, bravery, and professionalism. But we should never send them to war tying one hand behind their back and ask them to wage limited war against a dictator for whom, as I said earlier, this is total war. This is win or die. Military force is like a hammer, and you can't thread the needle that President Obama wants to thread with the hammer. I just want to conclude by saying that this debate, which is important and serious, and one that the American people expect us to have, this is not about isolationism versus internationalism. Believe me, I am no isolationist. And I fully support the global security role that America has played since World War II, since my dad was a POW. A world without American military dominance would be a much more, as Ronald Reagan noted, a much more dangerous place. I believe peace comes with American strength. However, it will be harder to maintain our global military dominance if we waste precious resources, our credibility, and political capital on hasty, misguided, unbelievably small interventions. Once again, Madam President, I would be willing to support an authorization for a military strike against Syria if it met certain basic criteria that I've laid out. But I cannot support an operation that is so poorly conceived, so foolishly telegraphed, and virtually guaranteed to fail. Madam President, I yield the floor.